A little girl in a pressed school uniform stood in the middle of a hallway she was never supposed to enter. Braids still neat from the morning. Shoes still clean. One small finger raised, pointing directly at a portrait that had hung on that wall for over 20 years. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't confused. She was certain. And that certainty, coming from a child who couldn't have been older than 11, was the most unsettling thing anyone in that mansion had witnessed in decades, because the man in that portrait wasn't someone you simply recognized. He was someone you were supposed to have forgotten. Someone the most powerful man in the state had made sure of. The fire burned low in the marble fireplace. The chandelier threw gold light across walls lined with history. Old power never creaks. It never whispers. And it simply sits, heavy, patient, untouchable, and waits. She looked up at him with clear, steady eyes. "Sir, why is my father in that portrait?" Victor Calloway, the man who had never flinched at anything, went completely still. Not angry, not threatening. Just pale. The kind of pale that doesn't come from shock. It comes from recognition. From something buried so deep, for so long, that when it finally surfaces, your body knows before your mind does. His hand found the back of the leather chair beside him. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way a man reaches for something solid when the floor shifts beneath him. And in that single moment, 11 years of buried silence cracked straight down the middle. By the time the full truth surfaced, it wouldn't just shake his empire. It would make him question every decision, every order, every sacrifice he had convinced himself was necessary. Because some secrets don't stay where you bury them. They wait. They grow. And one day, without warning, they walk back through your front door. In a school uniform. With their father's eyes. Now, before we go any further, let's stay here for just a moment. Because there are questions sitting in this story that don't have easy answers. And the deeper we go, the more uncomfortable those questions become. Who was the man in that portrait? Why had his face hung on that wall for over 20 years, in the private hallway of a man who trusted nobody, displayed nothing, and kept every corner of his life locked tight? And why, out of every person who had ever walked through that mansion, was it a child who recognized him first? Not a rival. Not a detective. Not someone with an agenda. A little girl in a school uniform who simply looked up and knew. Think about that for a second. She didn't hesitate, didn't squint, didn't ask a question like someone guessing. She stated it, calmly, completely. The way you identify someone you have loved your entire life. And the man standing across from her, Victor Calloway, a man who had faced federal investigations, rival organizations, and 30 years of threats, couldn't find a single word to say back to her. What did he know that she didn't? What had happened 11 years ago that made that name, that face, something no one in his world was allowed to speak? And why, after all this time, had he kept the portrait at all? Before we go deeper into that, drop a comment right now and let us know where you're watching from. We read every single one. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. Because what's coming in the next few minutes of this story is the part most people never see coming. This one is only just beginning. The Calloway estate sat at the end of a private road in one of the wealthiest counties in Connecticut. 12 bedrooms. 4 acres of manicured grounds. A gate that never opened without authorization. From the outside, it looked exactly like what Victor Calloway wanted the world to believe it was. Old money, quiet taste, generational wealth. The kind of home that appears in architectural magazines and charity galas. The kind that makes neighbors feel safe just knowing it exists on their street. Nobody asked too many questions about the Calloway family. In circles like that, you learn early that curiosity is expensive. Victor Calloway was 61 years old and had not aged the way most men do. He hadn't softened, hadn't slowed. His hair had gone silver in his 40s, and rather than making him look distinguished, it made him look permanent, like something carved rather than born. He wore dark suits every day without exception, spoke in measured sentences, never raised his voice because he had never needed to. The men around him had learned long ago that the quieter Victor became, the more dangerous the moment was. Anger was loud and predictable. Victor was neither. He had built his organization, legitimate on the surface, immaculate in its paperwork, across 3 states over 30 years. Real estate, private security contracts, import logistics. All of it clean enough to survive scrutiny. All of it connected, underneath, eyes to something that never appeared in any filing. He had no wife, no children of record, no close friends. He had associates, employees, and people who owed him things. That was the full extent of his personal world, and he had constructed it that way deliberately. Attachment, in his experience, was the one vulnerability no amount of power could protect. He had learned that lesson once. He had made sure he never needed to learn it again. His estate ran like a machine. Staff rotated on schedules. Access was tiered, and the private east wing, where his study and the portrait hallway lived, was strictly off-limits to anyone without explicit clearance. It had been that way for 11 years. Precisely 11 years. Rosa Vega had worked at the Calloway estate for 14 months. She was 34 years old, quietly spoken, nice and exceptionally good at her job. The placement agency that supplied Victor's household staff had given her the highest possible recommendation. Reliable, discreet, detail-oriented, no record of any kind. She arrived each morning at 7:15, worked through to 4, and never once stepped beyond the boundaries of her assigned areas. She cleaned the west wing, the kitchen, the guest quarters, and the formal reception rooms. She never asked about the east wing, never lingered near it, never gave anyone a single reason to look at her twice. In 14 months, Victor had spoken to her directly, perhaps 4 times. Her daughter, Zara, was 11 years old and attended a local private school on a partial scholarship. On the occasional days when school let out early or Rosa couldn't arrange after-school care, Zara would come to the estate and sit quietly in the staff break room near the kitchen, doing homework, reading, waiting for her mother to finish. The other staff liked her. She was polite, curious, and remarkably composed for her age. She had her mother's stillness and something else entirely in her eyes, a kind of focused attention, like she was always reading the room she was standing in. Victor had seen her once from a distance and thought nothing of it. She was the maid's daughter. That was the beginning and end of it, as far as he was concerned. He had no reason to think otherwise. Not yet. And then one Thursday afternoon in late October, everything he had buried for 11 years walked straight back into his life. He just didn't know it yet. It was a Thursday in late October. The light that came through the estate windows that afternoon was the particular gray gold of an East Coast autumn, flat and beautiful and slightly melancholy, the way October always feels when you're standing still long enough to notice it. Rosa was working in the east reception room, polishing the woodwork along the window frames. She had left Zara in the staff break room with a sandwich and a book, the same arrangement they'd used half a dozen times before. Zara was responsible. She knew where she was and wasn't allowed to go. She had never once tested those boundaries. But that afternoon, the estate's head housekeeper, a brisk woman named Arlene, had asked Rosa to move to the main corridor to assist with a delivery that needed to be cataloged and stored. Rosa had gone immediately, as she always did, leaving Zara alone in the break room. Zara finished her sandwich, read 3 more pages of her book, then heard something she hadn't noticed before, a faint ticking, deep and rhythmic, coming from somewhere down the hall. She had always been the kind of child who followed sounds rather than ignored them. She set her book down, walked to the break room door, and stepped into the corridor. The hallway to the east wing was not marked. There was no sign, no barrier, no obvious indicator that it was different from any other corridor in the house. To a child who hadn't been explicitly told, it simply looked like another part of a very large home. Zara walked slowly, her shoes quiet on the stone floor, the ticking growing gradually louder. It was a grandfather clock, an enormous one, dark mahogany with a brass face, eye standing at the far end of the hallway like a sentinel. She stopped in front of it and looked up at it for a long moment. Then she turned around to go back, and that's when she saw them. The portraits. A whole wall of them, formal, painted, each one lit softly from above. Men in suits, mostly. A few she didn't recognize, some older, some younger. She walked slowly along the wall the way you walk through a museum, not looking for anything specific, just looking. The smell of the hallway was different from the rest of the house. Older, drier, like paper and cedar and something that hadn't been disturbed in years. Her fingertips brushed the wainscoting as she moved. The clock ticked steadily behind her. Then she stopped. Her eyes had found a face, and her body understood it before her mind caught up. She stood completely still for several seconds, just looking. The man in the portrait was younger than she had ever seen him. His jaw was sharper. His expression was controlled, unreadable. But the eyes were exactly right. And along the left side of his jaw, almost swallowed by the shadow in the painting, was a thin curved scar she had traced with her finger 100 times when she was small enough to sit in his lap. Her chest tightened. Her throat closed slightly. And I want to pause here for a second, because I want you to put yourself in that hallway. You're 11 years old. You're somewhere you're not supposed to be. And suddenly, on the wall in front of you, is your father's face. A man you were told was gone. What do you do? Do you run? Do you stay? Tell me in the comments. Because what Zara did next took a kind of courage most adults don't have. Behind her, she heard footsteps entering the hallway. She turned. Victor Calloway stood at the far end, perfectly still, watching her, and without fully understanding why, she pointed. Victor said nothing for 11 full seconds. Zara counted them without meaning to. The clock behind her marked each one. His face had not moved, his expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted in a way she couldn't name and wouldn't understand until much later. He asked her, very quietly, to go back to the staff room. He used the word, please. People who knew Victor Calloway well would have found that word more alarming than anything else he could have said. He did not use it often. He used it now because he needed the girl out of that hallway before he allowed himself to react. He waited until her footsteps faded completely. Then he turned and walked directly to his study, closed the door behind him, and stood in the center of the room without moving for a long time. The bourbon he'd poured earlier was still on the corner of his desk. He didn't touch it. He stood there with both hands at his sides and breathed slowly, the way a man breathes when he is working very hard to stay in control of something that does not want to be controlled. His mind was already moving, fast, methodical, pulling at threads, because that was what it did. That was what had kept him alive and untouchable for 3 decades. But this time, the faster his mind moved, the worse the picture became. He went to the cabinet behind his desk. The bottom drawer, locked with a separate key he kept on his person at all times. Inside it were 3 files, the only physical documents he had never digitized, never photographed, never allowed another set of eyes to review. He pulled the one at the back. Thin, worn at the edges. He set it on the desk and stood over it without opening it for nearly a minute. Then he opened it. The report was 8 pages. He had read it once, 11 years ago, the night it was delivered to him. He had not opened it since. He read it again now, slowly, every word, every detail, the order he had given, the confirmation he had received, the names of the 2 men he had trusted to carry it out. 3 words at the bottom of the final page, handwritten by the man who had delivered the confirmation in person. Words that had satisfied him completely at the time. Words that now, after what he had just seen in that hallway, felt like the most expensive lie he had ever paid for. Target confirmed. Eliminated. He closed the file, sat down, and for the first time in 11 years, Victor Calloway allowed himself to consider the possibility that he had been deceived, not outmaneuvered, not challenged, deceived quietly, completely, and at enormous cost by the one thing he had always believed his world was immune to, a mercy he had never authorized. Someone, 11 years ago, had looked at what he ordered and chosen not to do it, and then lied to his face, and kept that lie intact for over a decade. Now think about that from Victor's side for a moment. He built his entire empire on the belief that his word was final, that when he gave an order, it was carried out. No exceptions, no mercy. And now he's sitting in his study realizing that foundation? It had a crack in it the whole time. How would you feel if you discovered that the one thing you were absolutely certain about wasn't true? Drop a comment, because Victor's next move tells you everything about who he really is. To understand what that portrait meant, you have to go back 20 years, back before the estate, before the organization spanned 3 states. Before Victor Calloway was a name that made grown men careful about what they said in certain rooms. Back to when he was 39 years old and operating out of a single office above a shipping warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, with 16 people on his payroll and a reputation that was still being built one careful decision at a time. That was the version of Victor that most people never got to see. Not yet fully formed, not yet untouchable. Still sharp, still hungry, and still capable in those days of something resembling trust. Marcus Vega came into Victor's world through a mutual contact in the logistics business. He was 34 at the time, lean, precise, the kind of man who arrived early to every meeting and never spoke until he had something worth saying. He had grown up in circumstances that gave him an instinctive understanding of how power actually worked, as opposed to how it presented itself. Victor recognized that quality immediately because he shared it. Within 6 months, Marcus was running Victor's transportation network with an efficiency that reduced losses by 40% and eliminated 3 separate points of exposure that Victor hadn't even fully identified yet. He wasn't just competent. He was indispensable. And over the years that followed, as the operation expanded and the money deepened and the complexity multiplied, Marcus remained the one person Victor consulted before any major decision. Not because Victor needed permission, but because Marcus was the only one whose judgment he genuinely trusted. They were not friends in the way that word is typically used. They didn't socialize, didn't share meals or personal histories, but there was something between them that operated like friendship, a mutual recognition, a shorthand, a sense that the other person was seeing things accurately. And in Victor's world, that was rarer and more valuable than loyalty. Loyalty could be bought, clarity could not. Now here's the part where this story stops being just a story and starts being a question about human nature. Because what happened next didn't happen because Victor was evil. It happened because he was certain. And certainty, without patience, is one of the most dangerous things a powerful man can carry. A deal collapsed in a way that pointed directly at an internal leak. $40 million in a structured real estate arrangement, legitimate on paper, critical underneath, evaporated over 72 hours because someone had talked to the wrong people at exactly the right time. Victor's investigators worked quickly, and the thread they pulled led, without ambiguity, to Marcus. Financial records. Timing. A communication that should not have existed. The case, as presented to Victor, was clean. Damning. Irrefutable. Victor did not ask for a second opinion. He did not confront Marcus directly. He made a decision in under 4 hours, the same speed and certainty he applied to every decision, and gave the order that night. What Victor did not know, what nobody told him, because nobody involved had any reason to, was that the evidence had been constructed. Carefully. Deliberately. by a man named Preston Cole, who had been quietly working against Marcus for 2 years, because Marcus had blocked a deal that would have made Preston enormously wealthy and instead had flagged it to Victor as a liability. Preston had waited, built his case piece by piece, and delivered it to Victor at a moment when Victor was already under pressure and in no state to slow down. It was a professional dismantling, the kind that only works when the target has absolute trust in the person being framed. And Victor's trust in Marcus was, ironically, exactly what made it so effective. The 2 men Victor sent that night found Marcus at a safe house outside the city. What happened next differed from what was reported. One of them, a man named Theo, who had worked alongside Marcus for 6 of those 11 years and could not bring himself to finish what he'd started, made a choice that night that he had never spoken of to anyone. He let Marcus go, bloodied, barely standing, with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and the understanding that if he ever surfaced again, the order would simply be reinstated. Marcus Vega disappeared into the night, and Theo went back and told Victor it was done. Victor summoned his investigator that same evening. Not his lawyers, not his security team, just one man, a former federal analyst named Garrett who had worked exclusively for Victor for 9 years and whose entire value was built on discretion and speed. Victor gave him 2 things, Rosa Vega's name and the instruction to go back as far as necessary. Garrett returned 36 hours later. He sat across from Victor in the study, set a single folder on the desk, and waited in silence while Victor read it. It didn't take long, but Victor read it twice. Rosa Vega had grown up in Newark, New Jersey. She had been 22 years old when she met Marcus Vega. No relation by blood, the name was taken later, after Zara was born, a decision whose significance Victor now sat very still thinking about. She and Marcus had been together for 3 years before his disappearance. Zara had been 4 months old the night Marcus vanished. Rosa had raised her entirely alone, moving twice in the first 2 years, working 3 jobs at various points, building something stable out of very little. There was nothing in her record that suggested anything other than an ordinary, difficult, quietly determined life. Except for one detail. The placement agency that had recommended Rosa to Victor's household, a firm he had used for years without incident, had been acquired 18 months ago by a holding company. A holding company that, when Garrett traced it back through 4 layers of incorporation, resolved to a name. See, a name that made Victor set the folder down and look at the wall for a long time. The holding company's original registered agent, before the layers of restructuring, was a man operating under the name Raymond Cross. Raymond Cross had 2 aliases on record and 1 prior identity. His birth name was Marcus Vega. Rosa had not stumbled into this job. She had been placed here, deliberately, by the man Victor had ordered killed 11 years ago. The question that followed was the one Victor sat with longest. Why? If Marcus was alive, if he had been alive all this time, if he had gone to the trouble of engineering his daughter's presence inside the one place in the world he had most reason to avoid, what was he after? It wasn't money. It wasn't exposure. If exposure was the goal, there were faster ways. It wasn't revenge either. Because revenge doesn't send a child. It sends something else entirely. Victor looked at the photo of Rosa in Garrett's file. 14 months she had worked in his home. 14 months of arriving at 7:15, staying within her assigned areas, never asking questions, never lingering. 14 months of quiet, unremarkable presence, while her daughter sat in the staff break room doing homework. And then he understood. Not fully, not yet, but enough to know that whatever Marcus Vega had set in motion, it had not been built around destroying Victor Calloway. It had been built around making him see something. The only question left was what? And I need to ask you something right here, because this is the moment the whole story turns on. A man who had every reason to want revenge chose something else entirely. He didn't send a threat. He didn't go to the authorities. He sent the two people he loved most into the home of the man who tried to have him killed. Why would someone do that? What does a person have to go through? What do they have to let go of to make that choice? Think about that, because the answer is in the next part of this story. He didn't call Rosa into his study the next morning. He waited, watched her arrive at 7:15, the same as always. Watched her move through her routine, the quiet efficiency of it, the complete absence of nervousness, and understood for the first time that what he had mistaken for unremarkable composure was something else entirely. She had always known this moment was coming. She had simply been waiting for him to catch up. He let her work through until 10. Then he sent Arlene to bring her to the study. Rosa walked in without hesitation. She stood in the center of the room, not near the chair he gestured toward, not against the wall, but squarely in the middle, as if she had measured the space beforehand and chosen her position deliberately. She was wearing her uniform. Her hands were at her sides. She looked at him with the kind of steadiness that takes years to build and cannot be faked under pressure. Victor studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "You know why you're here," he said. It wasn't a question. Rosa nodded once. "Yes," she said. "I've known for 14 months." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have finally stopped pretending. Victor leaned back in his chair and looked at her carefully. "He placed you here," he said. Another nod. "He asked me to come," she said. "Not to take anything. Not to threaten anything. He wanted someone inside this house who could see you clearly. As a person, not as a target." Victor's jaw tightened slightly. "And what did you see?" he asked. Rosa took a small breath. "A man who has been punishing himself for 11 years, she said quietly, for something he didn't fully understand when he did it. That was the moment the conversation changed. Because she was right, and they both knew it, and the accuracy of it landed somewhere Victor hadn't expected. He had anticipated strategy, negotiation, some form of leverage. What he had not anticipated was the truth delivered without cruelty by a woman who had every reason to be cruel. He asked her what she wanted. She told him plainly, not money, not an apology, though she said that would have meant something once, earlier. What she wanted was simpler and more complicated than either of those things. She wanted Zara to know who her father was, the real version. Not the ghost, not the silence, not the carefully maintained absence that had shaped her daughter's entire childhood. She wanted Zara to know that her father had been a man of substance and integrity who had been wronged and had chosen, in the end, to respond to that wrong with something other than destruction. "She asks about him," Rosa said. Her voice remained steady, but something behind it shifted, just slightly, the way a structure shifts when weight is added to the wrong point. "She has always asked about him. I have told her he's gone, that he loved her, that he was a good man. But she is 11 years old now, and good man is not enough anymore. She needs the rest of it." She paused. "He wanted her to have the rest of it. That's why I'm here." Victor looked at her for a long time after she finished. The bourbon on the corner of his desk had been there since yesterday. He still hadn't touched it. He asked her quietly, almost carefully, as if the question cost him something to form. "Is he still alive?" Rosa's expression shifted. Not into grief exactly, but into something adjacent to it, something worn and settled and permanent. "No," she said. "He passed 8 months ago. But he left something behind. For Zara," she paused. "And for you." Marcus Vega had survived the night Victor's men came for him by a margin so narrow it barely qualified as survival. Theo had let him go. Yes. But not before the encounter had left Marcus with 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, a gash along his jaw that would scar cleanly and permanently, and internal bleeding that went undiagnosed for 6 days because he couldn't go to a hospital under his own name. He had driven himself 4 hours north to a town in upstate New York, where a woman he had once done a quiet favor for gave him a room and asked no questions. He had come very close to not making it through that first week. The woman later told Rosa that there were 2 nights where she genuinely did not believe he would still be breathing by morning. But he did. Slowly, without resources, without his network, without anyone who could know he was alive, Marcus rebuilt a version of a life. He changed his name, moved 3 times over 4 years. I worked in logistics again, carefully, quietly, at a level far below what he was capable of, because visibility was the one thing he could never afford. He found Rosa again 2 years after his disappearance. She had not known he was alive. That reunion, in a parking lot outside a grocery store in northern New Jersey on an ordinary Wednesday morning, was something Rosa said she had never been able to describe accurately to anyone who hadn't been there. He met Zara for the first time when she was 2 years old. He was present for the next 4 years, in careful, limited, managed ways, never in one place long enough to create a pattern, never visible enough to be found. And then his health, damaged permanently by that first week 11 years ago, began to decline in ways that couldn't be reversed. He spent the last year of his life writing, letters mostly, to Rosa, to Zara, a series of them, sealed and dated, for her to open at different ages, and one other letter, one he had written and rewritten more times than any of the others, one he had debated sending through every possible channel and ultimately decided could only be delivered one way, by placing the person he trusted most inside the one place it needed to arrive. Rosa had carried it in the inside pocket of her coat for 14 months, through every 7:15 arrival, through every unremarkable Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. Through the morning, Zara pointed at a portrait and said the words that finally opened the door, and I want you to sit with that image for a second. A woman carrying a dead man's letter close to her chest every single day for 14 months, walking into the home of the man who ordered his death, for no other reason than because he asked her to, and because she believed it was right. Have you ever loved someone that completely? Have you ever carried something that heavy for someone else? Tell us in the comments, because what's in that letter, what Marcus actually wrote, is the part of this story I think about most. Rosa reached into the inside pocket of her coat and placed the letter on Victor's desk. It was a standard white envelope, slightly worn at the corners from 14 months of being carried close to her body. Marcus's handwriting on the front. 2 words, no title, no last name. Just Victor. Rosa did not say anything else. She left the study quietly, eyes pulling the door closed behind her. And for the second time in 2 days, Victor Calloway sat alone in a room with something he didn't want to face, and understood that he was going to have to face it anyway. He opened it slowly. 4 pages, handwritten, in the same precise and unhurried script that Victor had watched fill margins of documents and outline the edges of maps for 11 years. He recognized it the way you recognize a voice. Immediately and without question. He read the first paragraph and set it down, picked it up again, and read the rest without stopping. Marcus did not write about the night Victor's men came, did not describe what it cost him, did not list what had been taken or detail the years of absence or account for the damage done to Rosa and to a daughter who grew up asking a question that had no safe answer. He mentioned none of it. What he wrote instead, across 4 careful, unhurried pages, was about the years before. The work they had built together, specific moments. A negotiation in Philadelphia in the winter of 2009, where Victor had made a decision Marcus had initially opposed and later recognized as exactly right. A conversation in Victor's car outside the Newark warehouse, late at night, where Victor had said something about the nature of trust that Marcus had written down afterward and returned to many times. He wrote about what those years had meant to him, what Victor's belief in his judgment had meant to him during a period of his life when very few people had believed in anything about him at all. And then, in the final paragraph, Without preamble and without qualification, Marcus Vega wrote that he forgave him. Not because what happened was acceptable, but because carrying the alternative had proven over 11 years to be a weight that served no one, not himself, not Rosa, and not Zara, who deserved a father whose final chapter was not defined by bitterness. Victor read the last paragraph 3 times. Then he put the letter face down on the desk, pressed both hands flat against it, and sat there for a very long time. His eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them. He just sat there, the most feared man in the state, completely undone by 4 pages of forgiveness he had never earned and had been given anyway. Victor Calloway did not dismantle his empire overnight. That is not how these stories end. Not honestly, not realistically. What he did was quieter and, in many ways, more difficult. He began a process, deliberate and unhurried, of pulling back, removing himself from the parts of his operation that could not survive scrutiny, directing resources toward the legitimate structures that had always been capable of standing on their own. It took time. It took decisions that cost him money and influence and the loyalty of men who had no interest in a version of Victor that made different choices. He accepted those costs with a steadiness that people who had known him for years found difficult to explain. And here I want to ask you something. Genuinely. If you had spent 30 years building something, your entire identity, your power, your security, and a 4-page letter made you realize it had all been built on a decision you never should have made, would you have the strength to walk away from it? Or would you find a way to justify staying? Because that is exactly the question Victor sat with every morning for the rest of his life, and the fact that he chose to change anyway, quietly, without anyone to applaud him for it, says something about what forgiveness can actually do to a person when they let it in. He established a private trust, structured carefully, legally, untraceable to him on the surface, for Zara's education. He did not tell Rosa. He had Garrett arrange it through 3 legitimate intermediaries and left no instruction attached to it beyond the amount and the condition that it be available when she needed it. He kept the portrait on the wall. He had considered taking it down, decided against it. Some things should not be made easier to forget. He read Marcus's letter 11 more times over the following months, not looking for something new in it, but because there is a particular kind of reckoning that has to be returned to repeatedly before it becomes something you can carry instead of something that carries you. That was the work Victor Calloway spent the remainder of his life doing. Not loudly, not publicly, just steadily, one day at a time, in a mansion at the end of a private road where a portrait still hung in the east wing, and where, for the first time in 11 years, the silence felt different. So now I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before you answer. If you were Victor Calloway and you discovered that an order you gave, one you believed was justified, one you made with complete certainty, had been built on a lie told to you by someone you trusted, how would you carry that? Because it's easy, from the outside, to say what someone should have done differently. It's easy to look at a story like this and identify every moment where a different choice was available. But Victor made his decision in 4 hours, with incomplete information, under pressure, the way most of us make the decisions we regret most. The ones that feel like certainty in the moment and like devastation later. And what about Marcus? He survived. He rebuilt. He chose in the end not to spend whatever time he had left in pursuit of something that would have cost him the only things that still mattered: Rosa, Zara, and whatever peace he had managed to build in the margins of a life that had been taken from him. Was that strength? Was that wisdom? Or was it simply exhaustion dressed up as grace? Only he knew the answer to that, and he took it with him. What I know is this. The little girl in that hallway didn't know she was carrying a decade of history when she pointed at that portrait. She was just a child who recognized her father's face. And that single moment of innocent recognition did what no threat, no confrontation, and no strategy had managed to do in 11 years. It cracked something open. And sometimes that's all it takes. One honest moment from someone who doesn't yet know enough to be afraid of the truth. If this story moved you, if any part of it made you stop and think about trust, or forgiveness, or the weight of a decision you can't take back, subscribe right now, because the story we're releasing next is the kind people share at 2 a.m. when they can't sleep. You don't want to come back and find out you missed it. And if you're still on the fence about subscribing, drop a comment and tell me why. Either way, I'm glad you stayed until the end. That tells me everything I need to know about you.